Chapter 9. The demon with the stony obsidian skin shoved his massive sword into my father's chest, swung him high overhead, then twisted and slammed him to the ground. The low orange demons turned their ember eyes on me as they flooded across the field. Sweat rolled off my forehead when I shot up on the cot. Claustrophobia sent hot shivers through my body as I struggled to escape the heavy furs by kicking them to the stone floor. Pitch blackness surrounded me. I swung my legs over the side, then stood. In the darkness, I sensed the room tilting to one side and had to still myself to let the vertigo pass. Dim yellow light bounced off the stone walls outside, casting a glow across the doorframe. An elven man with white hair flowing to his shoulders appeared, carrying a candle upon a golden holder.
"Contessa?"
the elf asked in the darkness.
"Are you well?"
I forced steady breaths into my lungs, then nodded. Although I was anything but, the presence of a member of the majestic race my father so respected brought a sense of security as the images in my dreams faded. My shoulders dropped as his candlelight washed over me. "I'm fine." As he stepped across the threshold, the glowing flame flickered to create dancing shadows against his narrow features.
"I'm Giles Reynard, military attaché to Queen Semansia, stationed at the Fowler Foundation. I'm sorry I wasn't here to greet you sooner, but I returned late. I had been called to the Queen's Forest to plan our defense against attacks on the northern borders."
The flurry of words caused me to pause so I could absorb them, even though I didn't know why he'd be expected to greet someone as insignificant as me. I nodded my understanding.
"You called out in your slumber. Bad dream?"
I twisted the finger of one hand with the other and dropped my gaze there. "Yes, I lost my father recently. I revisited his demise in my dreams." The elf nodded, understanding.
"I suffer with you and pray to Solara you'll find relief with the blessing of time."
I half bowed. "Thank you."
"Come. I spied the shimmer of a portal in the great room, so I believe Roshan has arrived."
I glanced at the clock in the top right corner of my interface. "At 5 a.m? He nodded.
"The priestess is an early riser. If you ask her, she'll say Solara's work is never done, but I think she shares your sleeplessness because of the challenges she's faced these last few months."
"What challenges are those?" The elf showed his teeth in a crooked grin.
"It's not my tale to tell. Gather your robe, then meet us in the great room."
He set the candle on the table next to the bed, then noticed my staff leaning against the wall.
"Bring your weapon."
I glanced down. Upon realizing I wore only my underthings, warmth filled my face. The elf noticed.
"Don't worry. There's nothing new for my eyes here."
He gave an easy smile, then turned. "You don't need the candle?"
"It's for your benefit."
Giles raised 2 fingers, then pointed at his eyes.
"Elves can see in the dark."
"Oh, I didn't realize." But hadn't Shabana told me the citizens of the Foundation shared this attribute? A way to see in the dark? I made a mental note to tighten up, as Baba would say, lest these people get the impression I was some dim farm creature. He hadn't labored to educate me just to have my ignorance shine. But Giles didn't seem to mind. He waved a dismissive hand.
"Be well, Contessa of Milbury."
When the elf departed, I shrugged on the robe and watched as my intellect ticked up a notch thanks to the associated buff. The same thing happened when I stepped into my new sandals. I sensed my surroundings became clearer with the boons that washed over me, but it could have been my imagination. My staff leaned against the wall next to the doorway. I snatched it on my way out, but left my chunky, worn boots next to the bed so I could carry the candle Giles left behind. The candle flickered as I paced up the stony corridor. A poured-out sensation filled my chest. I was about to meet the priestess from Warrington. But when I stepped into the room and the woman with the flowing robes and shining black hair rose to greet me, I immediately knew she wasn't from there. Her eyes tilted down on the outside corner, and she was graced by a lovely coppery complexion apparent even in the blue glow of the portal. She smiled as I approached, and her face bloomed to life. "Hello, Tess. I am Roshan, Clan Fortuan of the Eastern Kingdom of Lao. It's a great honor to meet you." She pried my staff free of my clutches, then set it on the table. I bowed, not knowing what else to do. "The pleasure is mine, priestess." The outer edges of the portal collapsed toward its center, then it blinked out of existence. Roshan gestured toward a chair before lowering herself to one beside, then adjusting her robes around her. Every motion carried grace. She raised her brows and tipped her head back. "Would you mind if I analyzed you?" Since I'd yet to experience anyone else who asked, her question carried a certain dignity, a respect for my privacy. After my nod of consent, she blinked her eyes in succession. "Because of certain circumstances, I'm able to see all of your skills and attributes." Her eyes twitched left to right, back and forth as she read. "I understand Destiny found you, and you had only low staff skills. It seems you've gained a few. I practice with Shabana at the barracks." "Oh. It's good the two of you spend time together. Shabana will be a fine student at the academy, and judging by what I see here, you might too. Are you interested in learning magic so that you might battle the bastions of evil alongside other adventurers?" Her words seemed formal, but her inflection kept the serious topic casual. She had an accent I hadn't heard before, which made sense. I wondered if she'd been educated in schools or by a determined parent like mine. "Where is Lao?" I asked. "Across the Great Sea, in the east." "Is it beautiful?" "I find it interesting that beauty is your first concern." I wasn't sure how to take that. My head tilted quizzically to one side before I realized it. "Is that to imply I'm somehow shallow?" Roshan smiled widely, revealing rows of perfect white teeth. When considering the rest of her presentation and demeanor, this didn't surprise me. "Shallow? No." "Young?" "Yes." "And you think youth carries a quest for beauty?" She nodded. "Tess, I'm only 3 years your senior, and just turned 20 years old recently. By Solara's grace, we are attracted to beauty, but by Hokram's deceit, are we distracted by it?" I muttered words that echoed in my mind in the voice of my father. Speak the devil's name and he might appear. Roshan leaned back in the chair. "So you are pious?" "I don't think piety is an option. There is Solara, there is Hokram. I would choose the light, but I don't commonly utter platitudes." The words escaped my lips before I'd considered them. "Platitudes. Interesting." "I didn't mean to—" Roshan gave a clipped wave. "I might have once been offended, but since I was swept away from my home and have battled evil where it lives, I've encountered enough followers of the light who didn't outwardly express their sentiments to know better. Words are just words. The light is life's power and will serve those who study it regardless of devotion. Only actions determine our true allegiances." I nodded because I didn't know how to respond. "So a question stands," Roshan said. "What?" I retraced the conversation. "Oh, am I interested in learning magic to fight evil?" Fresh images of the demons charging me and their leader who killed my father returned. "Yes. In this I'm most interested." "And you would submit to the rules of the academy?" She didn't phrase it like a question. "Take what you learned and use it with conscience?" My eyebrows furrowed when I considered the questions. On their face, they were simple enough, and the answer to the second one was obvious. But how did I answer the first if I didn't know the rules? Common sense dictated that the priestess wasn't going to send a rules document to my interface to read while we sat there, so in her mind, I should have been able to answer. In the end, I remembered my father, and he would have trusted one so rooted in the faith. Despite my own reservations, since his own words,
"Trust no one,"
resounded to the contrary, I nodded. The rules would be explained, and if I found them too constraining, I could disappear. Whenever I imagined being around a crowd of people in the academy, my heart raced. I was born into and had lived my whole life in solitude. Baba left me behind when he went to trade. Although he explained the world was a dangerous place, the appearance of my mana bar and what I'd heard about the reformation of the academy since arriving in the strange burrow led me to deduce that wasn't the real reason. I eyed the priestess, wondering if maybe she could shed some light, excusing the pun. "Roshan, what would have happened if someone discovered my capacity for spellcasting earlier?" She nodded, understanding without pause. "You would have been registered with the Crown. You might have been sent to the academy, but until recently it was called the University of Warrington. While the spawn of the wealthy composed most of the studentry, there were some exceptions, and there were devious exploitations of the more destitute mana-imbued. I shall not bless with words. The way her full lips pinched into a white line showed how she looked upon it. She continued, "But these are new days. We take magic users who have reached their teens and help them realize their potential." "What happens to the younger ones? Older ones?"
"The young are left with their families. Since mana registration is no longer practiced, there's no hurry."
"What if the king decides to come and force his will to register them? I've heard this was his proclamation, that they be subjugated."
Subjugated is an astute word for it." She gave a quick sigh. "If the king comes, then this foundation and our allies will stand against him. We will always sue for peaceful solutions, but the king is but a boy, and he lives in the capital, very far from here."
"So as my father used to say, you will cross that chasm when you come to it." She nodded.
"Your father was a wise man, it seems. As to the older magic users, we are founding a smaller school to the south, near Brumhill."
"Brumhill? Why there?"
"It's isolated. No one will take a second look at such an insignificant place. Now," she clapped her hands, "are you certain you want to join Shabana and come to the academy?"
I decided that directness suited because of how straight the priestess had been with me. "If I come and decide it isn't for me, will I be able to return?"
"Although the master has final say on who lives in his foundation, I've yet to see him turn anyone away. He is truly a decent man."
"What's this master's name?"
"Forgive me, but we don't speak it to those he hasn't met. In light of the Eastern monarch's new interest in him, he insists we keep the names of him and his immediate family close to our robes. Knowledge of who and what he is could bring trouble to our doorstep, and we've already seen plenty. But come to the academy, grow into your power, learn balance, learn patience. If you don't like it, I'll be happy to partner with you in finding other options."
My head swelled with foreboding. If these people made enemies of the powerful, the academy might be a fine alternative to waiting here for coming trouble. I pressed my chin to my chest. "I will accompany you to the academy." Shabana strolled into the great room with the backpack covering her from her shoulders to behind. She flashed a smile, then kissed Roshan's cheek. The woman I'd met upon walking here with the short, spiky hair appeared behind her, dressed in a fine white robe. Liatra. Roshan cupped Shabana's face.
"Today you begin your walk on the goddess's path, my sister in the light."
They embraced, and when I saw the tight grasp they maintained in their hug, I couldn't help but feel left out. Liatra removed a long strip of leather from a satchel she carried over one shoulder. At the center of the strip was a long, tubular loop. She took my staff from the table, slid it into the loop, then tied the strip across my chest so the staff rested snug against my back.
"Is that comfortable?"
I nodded. "Yes, thank you." Liatra handed me a bag.
"Your old things. I thought you'd want to have them, to remember."
I clutched the parcel, then bowed my head in thanks. The caster raised her hands. Blooms of azure light surrounded them, then channeled from her palms into Roshan's chest. After a white line appeared in the space beside her, a portal sprang into existence, the same as it had when the burrow was under attack the day before. Through the opening, I spied a room with stone pedestals the height of my shins. Ripples of color snaked through marble floors. Roshan swept a hand toward the magical doorway, but when I stared through at the scene on the other side, my chest hitched. That magician so regularly used magic like this to travel long distances. How far could they go? Struck me with a sense of awe. But the expectation I'd step through it without question was a troublesome presumption. I knew these people as well as my long-dead mother, which is to say not at all. So when the priestess gestured for me to lead the way, I found my feet rooted to the floor. The priestess conveyed understanding.
"One step, then you'll be there. Just think of it like a doorway, except on the other side of this one is your promising future."
Future. My 17 years of experiences in Enora were constrained by a box outside which my father insisted I never go. The new experience of the burrow overwhelmed me with each new sight and sound, and the idea of expanding my world was overwhelming. "Here." Shabana stepped through the portal. On the other side, she turned to beckon me with both hands. Her lips moved, but her words didn't traverse the opening. I clenched my teeth, tightened my hands into fists, then stepped through. The transition went as promised, but a wall of warm air contrasting the cave-like great room's coolness sent cascading shivers down my spine. A knot tied up my gut over leaving the burrow behind, despite my only having been there a short time. Did its citizens live under a constant cloud of threat? Would I soon find myself back there under those same conditions? My distress diminished as I scanned my surroundings. Runes carved into the tops of the pedestals drew my attention first. Something about their curves and intricate detail struck me as beautiful. The walls surrounding me were covered in a papery surface attached to wooden beams, like a privacy curtain. The pedestal room wasn't circular as I'd assumed. Instead, it had 5 distinct walls on the other side of the paper. Maybe I would learn what to call the shape it formed around us at the academy. Plates of glass overhead followed the structure below, and midday light flowed through them. Roshan followed me through the portal, then Liatra mouthed the words, "Good luck." She waved goodbye, then flicked her hand to close the portal, which left me staring at the paper-fronted wall behind it. Why the paper? The priestess ran her fingers over the surface. A streak of subtle yellow waves followed their tips.
It's not paper. It's galleon. Master weavers use special looms and their mana to create it.
My mouth formed an O, and when I realized it, I clamped it shut. I've never heard of anything like it. May I? Roshan nodded. I raised one finger, then grazed the surface. The galleon sent warm, tingling energy through that digit, then into my palm. What's it for?
It insulates the room. You'll find it in the older structures around the academy. Stone is cold, and we want to keep our students and faculty warm. A cold body leaves a closed mind.
I like that. A cold body, a closed mind. It'd only been the day before when I struggled to build a fire in a snowy thicket near my home. If only I'd had some galleon with me. How is mana used to weave? I thought its purpose was to fuel spells. Roshan nodded.
Well, you're partially correct. Where your red bar represents your physical life force, think of mana as your spiritual life force. It can be used in ways beyond spellcasting.
She ran her whole palm over the surface, and with more contact, the yellow waves became brighter.
The mana is fed through the loom with a process called light weaving.
She scratched the fingernails of one hand in gentle motions near her collarbone.
How do I explain?
With words? I hadn't considered my own before I spoke them, and the reply reminded me I was my father's daughter. Warmth filled my face, but Roshan smiled.
You remind me of the master of the Fowler Foundation. This is what he calls being snarky. The way casters weave galleon is similar to an ancient process called mana weaving for which few possess the magic potency.
You're right, this is confusing. Roshan cocked an eyebrow that arched in its exact center.
Then perhaps I'll find out what kind of student you're going to make before we proceed.
Self-consciousness rose, but I pushed it back down, then nodded. I'm ready. My sudden determination felt inauthentic, but something told me this was a time to prove I belonged.
Are you familiar with the concept of ley lines?
I shook my head. Shabana tilted hers to one side, her determined stare and perked ears communicating rapt attention.
It wasn't until I came to Rubal that I learned the full extent of the lines, or at least the extent to which I understand them. There are special trees throughout Enora, planted across the many continents, born of the energy of the goddess herself. They're massive, their roots penetrate miles deep, and tap into these ley lines to feed them with the light. The energy in these ley lines is like concentrated mana, a very powerful spiritual force, if they can be tapped into. Those casters practiced in the art of meditation can reach deep into the ground and draw this energy to themselves.
Such concentrated power doesn't overwhelm them somehow? Roshan nodded, and the way her eyelids dropped to half cover her eyes, I suspected the gesture was one of approval.
The ley lines run so deep, the casters are protected by the ground between them and the source. Even then, the most powerful mana weavers I know, and they are few and far between, must focus throughout a cast and draw gradual energy into themselves to manifest the special magic.
Okay, I think I'm with you. The special weavers, the kind who work at a loom, draw this magic from the ley lines, then feed it to the paper to create galleon. Roshan shook her head.
No. As I said, tapping into the ley lines requires high light affinity, but the process used by the weavers channels their mana in much the same way as if they were to draw it from the underneath. They feed their mana pools into the looms. The paper is formed from the manor itself. There is no canvas on which to create the art, for they are the creators of the canvas. Does that make sense?
It does. She pointed at a sheet of galleon.
Analyze this sheet.
I did. Galleon sheet. This compound is constructed by channeling mana into a specialized loom. Material requirements? None. Level requirements? None. Light affinity? 90%.
That's neat,
Shabana interjected. She pivoted her head until she spied a stone door that matched the wall seen through the galleon.
Now where are we? When do we see our rooms?
Roshan chuckled, then swept her hand as she turned in a circle.
Hopefully your attention will be more focused when it comes to your studies.
I gazed at the pedestals surrounding us. Roshan sat on the edge of one, then ran her fingertips over a rune engraving.
These are tuning pedestals. High-level casters can tune these stones to certain locations throughout Rubal, and in some cases, other continents.
I leaned forward. Across the sea? Like where you're from? Lao?
Yes. You know, Lao is closer to the academy than the king's own seat in the west, despite the sea between Rubal and my home.
Shabana shook her head.
It sounds impossible. Ah, but it's not. Check your map sometime. Even though only places you visited are visible, the goddess has seen fit to label the landmasses divided by the seas. The king's seat is on the western coast of Rubal. If you compare, you'll see for yourself.
Maybe this was why the citizens of the Fowler Foundation weren't concerned about the king they disrespected. It would take quite a long haul across the continent to enforce his will. Perhaps the governor who'd been unseated represented the lone enforcer of the king's will in the east. She clapped her hands gently.
Come, we must give you the tour, then get you situated. You'll never learn anything if we stand around the receiving room all day.